Hi, everyone. So you say you like the Beatles, huh? Well, let's see. Hello, everybody. How are you? Happy Thursday evening from chilly 30-degree Queens, New York. This is Prime Time with Vinny B. Tonight, I could never stop talking about the Beatles. Obviously, those of you who know me know this. And I'll tell you why, because they were such an instrumental, pardon the pun, part of my life. Hey, Mitch. And I'm just checking out the football game here, which is on Prime. Thank goodness I have Prime. Rubber Soul was released December 3rd, 1965, August 8th, 1966. Revolver. In that 8-month period, we went from wow to oh boy. Rubber Soul. Okay. It's an album that I think signifies more than anything that the Beatles grew up. They were no longer the falling out of a car in a cartoon or Hard Day's Night. They looked a little different. They looked tired, actually, but it was their sixth album, and it reflected an entirely transformed Beatles that had burst onto the scene about 3 years before. Now, Beatles for Sale and Help showed them straining a little, I think, under the weight of Beatlemania. So you could see they were looking to explore new ways of creating what little did they know, or maybe they did know that 50 years later we would still be talking about them as the greatest band ever, possibly, depending what side of the fence you're on. Now, Rubber Soul completely moved them out of the hormonal young girl, yeah, yeah, yeah phrase into adult themes. And it set the stage. You started up the car, you drove to the entrance of the highway, hit the gas pedal, baby, and the highway was Revolver. And when you got off the exit and you went to your destination, that was Sgt. Pepper's. Those two albums would immediately follow. Now, for all the growth on Rubber Soul, it was a bit of a rush job, actually. They had a deadline. They had to have an album out for the holidays, and they scrambled for material, pulled a few songs actually out of the cupboard that they had written a few years before. But it still blends genres, soul, country for Ringo, folk rock influences, and it sounded fresh in 1965. Now, Drive My Car. It leads things off. By 1965, even though they were still touring, still in hotel rooms together, and all of that, John and Paul had started to write more separately. They'd frequently bring stuff into the studio to be polished up, but for the most part, they had their ideas. They weren't sitting eyeball to eyeball with guitars, trading line for line. Now, Drive My Car was one of the rare moments where they actually worked together on this song. Okay, he had the tune. McCartney hated the lyrics, so he drove out to Lennon's house for help, and they nailed the song by the end of the day. But one of the main contributions came from George Harrison, who suggested that the bass line and the guitar line be the same, just as they had heard a Steve Cropper and Donald Dunn do Otis Redding's Respect, and they were a big fan of Otis Redding. Obviously, George was. And obviously, it was a good idea because the egos of John and Paul said, okay. And there you had a real driving sound. Norwegian Wood, this bird has flown. Well, there's a scene in the Beatles' second movie, Help, that featured the group in an Indian restaurant. And that spurred Harrison's interest in the sitar because Indian actors were playing Indian music, and the sitar was one of the instruments. So he found a cheap one. He tuned it like a guitar, and the exotic instrument helped make Norwegian Wood what Norwegian Wood was, one of the album's standout songs. Now, Lennon's lyric was about an affair he had supposedly with Maureen Cleave, who was a friend of his and a journalist. And after he wrote the words about sleeping in the bathtub and setting the place on fire, a line that McCartney, I believe, claimed that he wrote so Lennon's wife wouldn't get suspicious that it was about an autobiographical affair. Who knows? McCartney is the whimsical storyteller. John is the self-confessional writer, so I could believe that was McCartney. This bird had flown. Bird is an English term for girl. Now, McCartney was having problems around that time with Jane Asher, his girlfriend, who was an actress, a traveling actress on the theater circuit. And a couple of the songs made their way on to the Rubber Soul tracks. You Won't See Me came after she left London over his objections to perform a stage adaptation of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations in Bristol. McCartney took his frustrations out in the song with a chord progression and a bass line he borrowed from the Four Tops. And you could hear Ringo's hi-hat pattern is much different on that song. Nowhere Man. It showed Lennon's willingness to tackle more introspective themes. And he did that on Beatles for Sale. I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, right? And Help, You Gotta Hide Your Love Away. And Help, I Need Help. They didn't think he needed it, but he did. He wrote Nowhere Man as he started to nap. He spent 5 hours that morning trying to write a song that was meaningful and good, and he couldn't get anything going. He finally gave up to lay down. And then everything came to him as he laid down. Now, Nowhere Man wasn't a single in the UK. It reached number 3 in the US in 66, and it was included on the LP Yesterday and Today in America. Think for yourself. Harrison, his first contribution to this album, after listening to a few, was one of the trifle moments. You could see the difference in the lyrical content. Lyrics about opening your mind, missing the enlightenment tone he was aiming for, didn't get there. But still, I think it's a pretty catchy song. McCartney uses the fuzz bass, and that pretty much he uses that as a lead guitar, which is pretty cool. And the harmonies are pretty nice. So it made the song probably better than it actually is. The word, I love this because way before The Summer of Love, John Lennon said the word was love. So look how cutting edge he was. 2 years before, All You Need Is Love. The concept, the word showed you what it was. It's a true Lennon McCartney collaboration as well. Lennon says that the song was mostly his. The pair wrote it under the influence of pot. No shit. And they wanted to pen the song on one note. So you see that they were under the influence. Michelle. The origins of Michelle is very interesting. It first released single from Rubber Soul. It goes back to the days of the Quarrymen. Paul McCartney wrote a chord progression inspired by Chet Atkins, trombone. The country guitar legend picked a melody on the lower strings and kept the higher strings constant. It's a French aspect, and the lyrics came from a time when McCartney would attend parties thrown by a friend of Lennon's from the art school. He pretended to speak French to meet women dressed in all black, black turtleneck, black pants, very sit on a windowsill. Now, as the Beatles scrambled for material, like I had said, Lennon reminded McCartney, remember that song he used to do? He suggested I Love You, lyrics in the bridge based on Nina Simone's I Put a Spell on You. Now, McCartney would work with Jan Vaughn, the wife of a longtime friend who was a French teacher, and she was credited with co-writing, and McCartney sent her a check as a thank you. The French words. What Goes On? Ringo. Ringo's spotlight single recording on the album. Indulging in his love for country music. He always loved country music. And it even landed him his first songwriting credit. But he said he really contributed about 5 words. But you still helped. As with Michelle is different, but What Goes On had been written a few years earlier. Lennon wrote it before the band had a contract. They hoped to record the song in '63, but they ran out of time at the session. Now, when preparing for it in '65, McCartney added the parts and made a demo and gave it to Starr, who then added his own ideas. And that was the B-side of Nowhere Man. Now, the B-side of Michelle was Girl. Girl probably is the predecessor of Woman, which John Lennon wrote 15 years later, a maturer version. Now, it had 2 great elements of Beatles songs. Lennon's lyrics. He questioned his religious teachings about you have to understand suffering in order to find happiness, and the band's humor. The background vocals in the bridge, the word was tit. Tit, 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 tit. They admitted it. The 2-part acoustic guitar break near the end of the song was inspired by McCartney. He heard a song in Greece, and it inspired him. They were traveling around a lot at that time. I'm Looking Through You. Love songs are McCartney's stock and trade. Always were. But he can be vindictive, especially when he's mad at Jane. And he doesn't quite sacrifice his melodic instincts or the song to show you he's annoyed. Like You Won't See Me, I'm Looking Through You. It was inspired by his troubles. The couple split for good in '68, although I have a feeling Paul thought they were split since the day he went out with her. And Ringo plays the organ on that song. Yeah. In My Life. Lennon started In My Life as a nostalgic look at Liverpool. And an early draft of that song mentioned Penny Lane. Because Penny Lane, Paul wrote the song, he used to visit John. John lived near Penny Lane, not Paul. But he felt it came across like, what I did on my holiday bus trip when you have to come back to school and write an essay or a book report for first day of school you did this summer. And it turned out to be one of his most celebrated songs, probably one of the best songs in the Beatle catalog. George Martin wrote the Baroque inspired piano part, but he couldn't play it at the song's tempo. So he slowed down the tape to a manageable speed, which made the piano sound more like a harpsichord. So George Martin was on that. George Martin also played piano, I believe, on rock and roll music. Um, Wait, it was recorded in June '65 for Help. Didn't make the cut for the album. They scrapped it last minute before the album went out. And if you listen to the song Wait, kind of sounds like Help. So as the Rubber Soul sessions wound down, the Beatles realized they were one song short and dusted off the old track, which was only less than a year before. On the last day of the recording, they overdubbed the harmonies, percussion, and new guitar part by Harrison, freshened it up to where it sounded modern, although it wasn't even a year old. So, if I needed someone, if I needed someone, that clangy guitar, George Harrison was hanging out with the Byrds at that time and was listening to songs like Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, stuff the Byrds were doing. They were using that clangy guitar. George liked it. He was friends with Roger McGuinn. Now, uh, McGuinn played a 12-string Rickenbacker after seeing Harrison play one in A Hard Day's Night. That's the guitar Harrison used. So Harrison kind of returned the favor by using the riff If I Needed Someone on the Byrds version of the Bells of Rhymesney. So the result was it was Harrison's best song to date. Group harmonies were amazing. Great bass line by Paul. And it was one of the highlights of the album. And that many people don't realize, or maybe you do, it's the only Beatles song that George ever wrote that was played live. They never did Taxman live. Run for Your Life. That's a throwaway. John hated the song. Don't know why they put it on. It totally. The album is so good you can't bring it down a peg, but it brings it down a quarter of a peg. He took his closing line from Elvis Presley's "Baby, Let's Play House." I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man. So he nicked that. Nick means stealing in British. And it took it even further, really. Run for Your Life was disavowed for the rest of his life. Lennon couldn't stand it, calling it a throwaway in his least favorite Beatle album. So there was nothing redeeming about that song, but the album was amazing. Now, interestingly enough, we'll get to Revolver, but Rubber Soul, it had no true love songs. Think about it. The type where a singer's in a happy relationship with someone, anyone. It has songs about sex, Norwegian Wood, desire, Michelle, anger, Run for Your Life. No love songs, unless you count Wait. And I don't, because Wait was from Help. They cheated. Now, George said that the recording process for this album and Revolver could have been like a double album, and I agree. It would have been a great double album. Not as good McCartney's two albums, but Tug of War and Pipes of Peace. Basically, the stuff that didn't make it off Tug of War went to Pipes of Peace. You could put them as volume 1, volume 2 in a playlist, and it would be the greatest artificial double album of all time. Now, you like Revolver more once we get to it, but Rubber Soul was the first baby. You always have a little infinity for the firstborn. Because to me, there are fewer skippable tracks. There's a couple of tracks in Revolver that, you love them, but you won't go right to them. There's fewer tracks other than Run for Your Life on Rubber Soul that you never get sick of. I think if you dropped For No One off Revolver, Here, There, and Everywhere, and Eleanor Rigby, and replaced them with a couple of slower but more electronically infused songs, it could be the same album. Um, Now, Revolver, I love because we'll get to those songs and they're just different. It's not that they're better, they are different. It's like you come back from summer vacation from seventh grade to eighth grade when you last saw some classmates in June. You grew an inch and a half and you got a light mustache now and your hair's 3 inches longer. You look different. Doesn't mean you didn't look good 3 months ago, but it's two defining albums. Now, Revolver, August 8th, 66. People love Revolver. And I've also heard people think that Revolver is overrated. I think Sergeant Pepper is overrated, and I'll tell you why. Because Sergeant Pepper was supposed to be an art concept album, never got there. They started it and then scrapped it. Sergeant Pepper, and with a little help from my friends, and then that was it. It wasn't an art concept at all. They wanted it to be, but it didn't. A couple of songs had nothing to do with a conceptual album. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It's nothing to do with a fictitious band. To generations of listeners, though, especially raised in the digital era, you could almost feel it's overrated, but you didn't hear it the way it was supposed to be listened to. It's kind of like trying to explain to my son what people did to entertain themselves before we had cell phones and iPads. You just don't understand if you weren't there. The genius of the Beatles lies in their innovation. The songs are tangible evidence of the innovation, but if you're here now, you don't see it. They broke the rules, accepted songwriting rules, production techniques. They broke it all. They did what they wanted. And what they produced nearly a half a century ago on an analog tape with limited track stands the test of time. It's relevant today, even in digital production. Limitless tracks, computer aided sound engineering still sounds amazing. Now, due to their great success, they had a license to kill. They could do whatever they wanted. By the end of the summer of 66, they ended touring, and the primary focus would be recording albums as the individual members settled into domestic life in England. McCartney lived in the city near Abbey Road. The rest were 45 minutes out. Now, while they released Rubber Soul for Christmas, it kicked off the evolution, like I said. They weren't four mop tops just simply playing guitar-based pop rock songs with ethnic instruments and a folk rock sound. Revolver pushed the band into a new direction, eclectic mix of sounds spun together in unconventional ways that had never been done before. It didn't only work brilliantly, it laid the groundwork for their future sound and other bands' future sound. And it's also kind of the beginning of the end because you start to see the individualistic styles of songwriting. You see the difference now, really markedly different, George, John, and Paul. Like in the past, most songs were credited to Lennon and McCartney, but on Revolver, they're more McCartney or more Lennon, and you could hear the difference now that they are not really writing together anymore. Couldn't as much with Rubber Soul. Now, it's important to realize that there are two different versions of this album. The international music business is crazy, and in UK, the versions of the albums weren't altered. In America, they would stick songs that the Beatles had recorded a year and a half ago on an album and stick them on an American album. And the Beatles felt chronologically it was very important to hear it as they had recorded it. And Revolver wasn't released in the US in this form until 1987 with the digital CD. and it was settled that the UK versions were the official Beatle albums, so the versions would have to be those versions. The set list: Taxman, Eleanor Rigby. We'll go through them. Now, the album kicks off with Taxman, George Harrison's best song up until that point, inspired by the high income tax rates that the band was paying over doctors and lawyers and all that in Great Britain, sometimes as much as 95%. But I believe that's a fallacy. I think anything that you made over $4 million or £4 million was taxed at 95%. So they did not lose 95% of all their earnings. Anything over 4 million, it went to 95%. It's taking a shot at Harold Wilson, the British Labour Prime Minister. It's a political song. First political song the Beatles ever did. And it's funny that George did it. And it was a bold move at that time. You know, there were several straightforward rock pop songs on Revolver that really depicted swinging London. As Your Bird Can Sing, Dr. Robert, McCartney's Good Day Sunshine. But the heart of the album is built on very unconventional songs. Okay. Now, Eleanor Rigby, layers of strings and vocals. The instrumentation and the arrangement was perfect for lonely people in the song. And I don't believe any Beatles play an instrument in Eleanor Rigby. They don't play any instruments. McCartney's lead vocal and the backing vocals of the other band members. That was it. No instruments. The string octet George Martin put together. McCartney also wrote For No One, the mellow song. He played the clavichord, a famous French horn solo played by Alan Civil, who was very renowned at that time. Here, There, and Everywhere showcases his knack for writing and arranging beautiful melodies. So although he's written beautiful melodies before, you're really starting to see McCartney now. You know, he's the grand old age of 24. Gotta Get You Into My Life was influenced by the Motown sound and uses a lot of brass, but it was really about pot. Now, it wasn't released as a single in the US until 76, 10 years after Revolver and 6 years after the Beatles disbanded. And amazingly, it became the top 10 hit at that time in 1976. Harrison's Love You Too, fascination with Indian music, sitar front and center. Now, it was used previously on Norwegian Wood, but it's really used here because everyone knows about it now. And his third and final composition of the album was a piano-driven I Want to Tell You, which was pretty good. Far more traditional, and that sounds like it could be from the Help album as well. Lennon wrote I'm Only Sleeping. He was a lazy guy, mostly drug-induced, and he was always sleeping. The difference between being awake and being asleep. The backwoods guitars add to the confused feeling of John's vocals, which are different. She said, lyrics almost taken verbatim from a conversation he had with Peter Fonda in LA when they were partying. They were under the influence in 1965 when they went to see Elvis. During the conversation, Fonda had said he knew what it was like to be dead. As a boy, he found a gun in the house or something, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and almost, I think he was pronounced dead actually for a bit. And that's what that was about. But he said, she said instead of he. Now, the most groundbreaking song was the psychedelic final song, Tomorrow Never Knows. It was inspired by Timothy Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience. In fact, Timothy Leary, when he was going to run for office, wanted John to write a song, which John did, Come Together, a couple of years later. And then Leary got mad when John used it as a song on an album because he had fell out of favor, I think, with Timothy Leary at the time. It's a drone-like song, reverse guitar, processed vocals going through a machine. looped tape effects, and several simultaneously run tape machines processing Lennon's voice. Jeff Emmerich, the great producer, did that. Engineer, really, but he's a producer as well. And then you have a child like Yellow Submarine. They gave Ringo his token song for Revolver. And all four band members, including Ringo and the production team, overdubbed stock sounds from the studio's tape library, the soundscape in the background. It's considered to be one of the top albums of all time. It marks the beginning for me of the second half of the Beatles' career. Highly influential classic albums right until the end. So what makes it all that special, though? Hey, Larry. Hey, Reed. Now, I'll tell you what I think, which doesn't mean much. As if I had to grade them, consistency, Rubber Soul wins. There's no song on that. Well, let's take Run for Your Life out of there. There's no song that doesn't fit the mood perfectly. Okay? I wouldn't be upset if Revolver cut out Dr. Robert, A Good Day Sunshine, Yellow Submarine, and put Rain in there instead. So Revolver's consistent. In a different way. You know, for me, Rubber Soul is consistent. Revolver not as consistent, but the guy hit 60 homers because the songs are that good. A couple of them are the best the Beatles ever made. Here, there, and everywhere. For no one, she said, "I'm only sleeping, Taxman, Eleanor Rigby." On and on and on. There's too much firepower to be able to give Rubber Soul the nod. Rubber Soul really has a couple of songs that crack the greatness of Revolver, and that would probably be Nowhere Man and In My Life. And I think Revolver, for me, the Beatles were very unified on this album. You are starting to see the differences in their songwriting techniques. Paul finally caught up to John's songwriting ability, I think, on this album. Up until then, it was a close horse race, but John was winning. I think Paul took the lead here. But I don't know if that's because the pendulum swung because John became disinterested. He was always under the influence of LSD. And maybe Paul had a big advantage. I don't know. But Paul took the lead in creativity there. And George got to pen more songs than any other album. And when you get a new singer singing, which George was, it really sinks in how they were really willing to share at that time. So they were really getting along. They let George sing. His songs are getting songwriting royalties. So the selfishness wasn't there at that point. I think Paul was so happy he was really starting to graduate as the leader. All right, Paul, George. It was almost like Paul probably said, "Okay, George, you could do it," just to prove he's the boss. So I love both of the albums. They sound unlike anything else in the Beatle catalog. That's what makes them stand apart and together at the same time. It's like when you meet a girl, your differences make you fall in love. Opposites attract, but not in divorce court. Same kind of thing. Now, the things about Revolver that I believe eke out the win is song quality, I think. I think the songs are a little better on Revolver. A stronger finale. Um, and I think it's an official break from their original image. You see, Rubber Soul, you could still not quite mop top Revolver like a different band did it. Revolver, you would believe that Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band made that album, that it wasn't the Beatles. They recreated their image. The song quality, okay? Purely subjective. I think that Revolver's style to Rubber Soul's is a little different. Rubber Soul briefly kind of introduces the psychedelic style, right? Nowhere Man. But Revolver took it to a whole new level. Um, Tomorrow Never Knows. And when I see songs like Wait, If I Needed Someone, and Run for Your Life, they don't come close to perfection. I Want to Tell You, Got to Get You Into My Life, Tomorrow Never Knows. It's groundbreaking. But the best finale of all time is A Day in a Life. A Day in the Life, Rubber Soul, right? So you see, you can go back and forth all day. I think Rubber Soul started the beginning of the end of the boy band image associated with the Beatles at that time. Revolver took that image, threw it on the ground, stomped it, set it on fire, molded it, melted all the ink and clay, and out came something else. And when the Beatles stopped touring, I think their albums sounded a lot different as well. It was just a transition into a new era. A new era is not touring either. You have to remember, not touring, you're in a different mindset. You're more rushed when you're touring, knowing you're going on tour and you got to get these songs out. Now, Rubber Soul, if you want to go back and forth, so Revolver has the stronger material, a little more succinct with what they were trying to do, being psychedelia mavens. But now, the style, Rubber Soul, it's not quite clearer than Revolver in terms of what it was trying to say. But it was such a big change of pace from Helper, Hard Day's Night, that you give it the edge. It was more of a difference than Revolver was to Rubber Soul. You know what I mean? Greater distance in how they sounded. So it really showed the difference, which was only 6 months before, 8 months before, from Help to Rubber Soul. You don't think you're listening to the same band. Revolver, you kind of know you are. There are some songs that are very similar. Uh, Revolver is also all over the place with his styles. Rubber Soul is pretty consistent, but it's hard to complain about those distances, right? Now, the Beatles on the charts went on a downhill slope a bit that wouldn't be corrected till Sergeant Pepper. Rubber Soul was on the charts and went to number one, Logan and Revolver. Okay. Um, I think it's a lot of controversy surrounded the band at that time. When Revolver was released, they had the problem in Budokan, the Philippines, the Philippine incident, the Butcher cover, Yesterday and Today, John's more popular than Jesus comment. I think none of that had happened when Rubber Soul was released. The Beatles had to fight an uphill war on a couple of fronts during the Revolver release. I think time had passed for Sergeant Pepper enough where John apologized and they hadn't been on the road in everybody's face. And I think they were more forgiven. And Sergeant Pepper was such a good album, you couldn't even make believe you didn't like it. Now, I think the Revolver's the better album. I think Rubber Soul will have a larger legacy than Revolver because of the difference, the wide range of influences. Both have a number one song. I don't love Good Day Sunshine. I don't love Michelle from Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul has some songs that I could do without. Run for Your Life, What Goes On. And with Revolver, it's not that I could do without them. I passed them by, but they're still great. The Rubber Soul, those two songs, I would actually lift the needle. This, I'd say, I don't know, I'll listen to it for 3 minutes. Now, you go to Sergeant Pepper. It's hard to compare Sergeant Pepper to anything. When you go from Rubber Soul to Revolver, you have modern classical Eastern music, Western pop, Hinduistani raga. You have all of that crap. Electronic composers like Stockhausen with Tomorrow Never Knows. That was influenced Stockhausen. McCartney was a big guy. So was Lennon into Stockhausen. The back taping and I'm Only Sleeping. I think Revolver was more influential, whatever term you want to use. They're both an enjoyable listen. I think Revolver's material was stronger, but because the Beatles changed so much from Help to Rubber Soul gets extra credit for that. How's that? Now, I also think a couple of musician questions were answered. I think Paul's bass playing became much better in Rubber Soul. Maybe he was using the Ringo technique of not over the top, not sure up until Rubber Soul. But it's much more integral and complex than in prior albums. Absolutely. I think that was one of the big differences in the sound, other than the songs being totally different. McCartney's upfront bass playing on Rubber Soul. Now, some of the worst Rubber Soul songs kind of sound like the Monkees, stuff the Monkees would. If you gave the Monkees those songs to sing, it would have gone to number one, right? I'm not really into Indian music, especially when it's front and center. I do like it when it counters something, where you can go from Dr. Robert to then a tambour or something like that. Guitars, solos aside, Paul played Taxman. He played the lead guitar on that. And George gave him credit for that. George just couldn't get it down. Revolver had the Indian mix much more than Rubber Soul. And George also was starting to get album tracks. Also, Paul seems, with his songwriting, very unhappy with Rubber Soul. I'm looking through you. You won't see me. He seems like a happy camper in Revolver. So I guess that 6-8 month period, he got a little happier. If you prefer early Beatles to late Beatles, you probably like Rubber Soul more. If you prefer late Beatles, you probably like Revolver more. Because I think that those albums, as legendary as they are, give you a little of everything and a lot of nothing, if that makes any sense. Yeah, Reed, Eleanor Rigby's wonderful. Donning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. Ringo wrote that line. Norwegian Wood's really good. That was an affair he was having with Maureen Cleave. Now the White Album, Larry, outstanding album, outstanding. You have Dear Prudence and Julia, which in a 3-month period, John Lennon learned that picking style from Donovan. Donovan taught him that picking style that he used on Julia and Dear Prudence. So right there, the innovation of learning a new picking style and right away putting on an album is pretty cool. And the songs were very personal. Rocky Raccoon. Paul had read an article. Paul also, in 1965, it might have been, went to Denver with Mal Evans to visit Jane Asher, who was doing a play. And he went through the Midwest and all that. And he tried to put on an exaggerated Texan cowboy type of accent. Birthday, George Harrison turned 25, I believe. And they wrote that song for George. And why don't we do it in the road? McCartney saw two monkeys doing it in the middle of the road. Happiness is a Warm Gun. John Lennon was reading a magazine. Many people, they banned it because they thought it was about heroin. First time John started using two different codas in songs where the middle sounds totally different than the actual verse. Mother Nature's Son. Mother Nature's Son was why John Lennon changed. John Lennon's song, Child of Nature, became Jealous Guy. You know the song Jealous Guy? But Paul and John didn't want nature mentioned twice because they had Mother Nature's Son. This is the original song that John re-lyriced and repurposed a couple of years later. It's Jealous. Listen.
I was dreaming more or less,
Changed all the words and made it Jealous Guy.
and the dream I had was true. Yes, the dream I had was true. I'm just a child of nature.
And then you had a song that was never released that John wrote in Rishikesh. They were going to do it, and then they decided not to. It was going to be on instead of me and my everybody's got something to hide for me, except for me and my monkey.
She looks as an African queen. She eating 12 chapatis and cream. She tastes as Mongolian lamb. She coming from Aldebaran. What a shame Mary Jane had a pain at the party.
I can see why that didn't make it. Now, George wrote a beautiful song that showed up 5 years later or more than that, that I thought was very nice. This ended up on his solo album. It's actually a nice song.
Friends come and friends go, as I go round and round in circles. Love warms and love.
So you see a lot of different mixes, influences, and all that. In fact, George got annoyed at them because when they broke out the guitars, he said, "You know, we're not here to write songs and make an album. We're here to meditate." Now, my question was, why did John and Paul bring guitars in the first place? Right? If you were there to meditate, I don't bring my guitar to church. Well, that's because I don't go to church, but you know what I mean. But Mother Nature's Son, good song. The White Album read was an eclectic mix of, look, you could say that this is the first heavy metal song, and I'd almost buy it.
From the slide, we'll stop and a turn and I go for a ride till I get to the bottom and I see you again. Yeah.
Now, he wrote that in response to I Can See for Miles, which was a very loud song. He had heard it from The Who and wanted to get dirtier. He thought it was a very dirty sound, very loud. That inspired McCartney to write that. But Helter Skelter, basically, when he had gone to see Jane Asher, a big roller coaster. That's what gave him the idea. But look, these guys are amazing, right? Amazing. I'm going to do a review of the White Album and Sergeant Pepper probably during the week, but just amazing stuff. And if you listen to some of their solo work, it bleeds through a bit. It does. Not often can you say that any of the Beatles wrote something that was comparable to what they were doing together. But there are a couple of songs. Um, because you could take Paul out of the Beatles, but you can never take the Beatles out of Paul. Same thing with John. As much as they tried, they were still Beatles. I hope you have a great night. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you soon. Okay. Good night, everybody.